Hi, this is Roger Joseph Manning Jr., and you're listening to Your Morning Coffee, the podcast with Jay Gilbert and Michael Etchart. Weekly music news for the new music business. You're not going to want to miss this.
This week, we sit down with some very smart people. RUSS CRUPNICK from MusicWatch, independent analyst Richard KRAMER, and Beatdap CEO Morgan HAYDUK.
From Billboard, if the music business keeps growing, why the layoffs?
And from MusicWeek, industry leaders on key issues including artist development, exports, and AI. There's that word again, Jay. AI. We keep talking about it. Well, we're glad you are all here, I should say. Jay and I are ready to start the show right about now.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air. On the air. On the air. On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Jay, it is good to see you, my brother,
Good to
on
see
a
you.
warm day here in SoCal.
Yeah,
It
can you
feels like
believe it?
summer.
Yeah, it feels good.
It's lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. We had busy weeks, and we were ships passing in the night. We were
Yeah.
actually at the same place on the same day, but different times. And
Yeah, that was
busy,
fun.
fun week.
Yeah, we had NAMM. For those that didn't go, it was really cool. I was actually only there one full day. I did a session on monetizing and merch and things like that went really well. It was really a lot of fun. But I also popped my head into the immediate family sort of Q&A, and you know, we've talked about them a lot on this program. I just love those guys. But how was your NAMM experience?
Oh, it was fantastic. And for those that don't know, the NAMM show, NAMM, it's the National Association of Music Merchants. And this is where they show all of the new gear to make music with. So everything from oboes to digital tools to everything in between. Yeah, and it's one of the longest running trade shows in America. It started around 1901, and it's the funnest thing that I get to do. First of all, you just go and pull a guitar off the rack and play it, and you see lots. And we're getting to an age where we know so many people in the business, and it was fun to see artists and people that work in that side of the world. And I had a good time. Got to do some interviews and meet a bunch of people and see a bunch of people I haven't seen for a long time. Yeah. And this is kind of the first. The NAMM show has been historically always in January here in Anaheim, actually. But of course, we got one in 2020 just before COVID hit, and then missed 2021, and they did kind of a truncated one mid-year in 2022 and last year. So this is the first kind of big one, and it's an international show, so you've got people from all over the world there, and it was a lot of artists and performances, and you did one of the workshops, and
it was fun.
It's a good time.
I had read that there was something like 150,000 people this year that went through those doors, and man,
it was packed.
It was just a blast, and I think next year I'm going to try to do more than one day, because you can't see the thing in one day. There's just too much to see, but
absolutely.
But I really enjoyed that. Couple of things before we jump in. The Grammys are coming up Sunday, February 4th. It's the 66th Grammy Awards. You can see that on CBS and Paramount Plus. And you and I were talking before we hit record that sometimes there's a little bit of confusion around some of the categories. And I listened to the Trapital podcast this last week, which is always good. Dan Runcie's, right? He had Zach O'Malley Greenberg on, and they talked about the business behind the Grammys. So if you want to see how the sausage is made a little bit, check out the most recent Trapital podcast. And you and I were sort of talking about some of these things are a little bit confusing, like record of the year versus song of the year. And they even point this out in the podcast. And for those that don't know, simply put, record of the year deals with a specific recording of a song and recognizes the artists, producers, engineers, anyone that contributes to that recording, while song of the year, that really deals with the composition of that song and recognizes the songwriters who wrote the song. So that's just a sample of some of the things that you'll learn when you listen to the Trapital podcast this week. Pretty cool.
Always a worthwhile listen, and as you know, I've mentioned a couple of times, the last couple Grammy Award presentation shows have been just awesome, really fantastic.
Oh yeah,
and it's kind of a must see. I mean, it's always been very interesting to watch, but it was always kind of stodgy there near the end of the last a few years back, and they've really turned the corner.
Yeah, they really have.
I love watching the show.
Yeah, me too. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that I got a note from our friend Bruno Del Granado. He's the head of Latin music over at or Latin music touring over at CAA, and he sort of keeps us up to date on what's going on in Latin music. And he sent me this article, which I hadn't gotten to yet. It was from Billboard, written by Lila Cobo. And the headline was, "Spanish is now the most consumed language for music in the world." Did I say most? Spanish is now the second most consumed language for music in the world. And really, thanks to increased consumption of artists like Peso Pluma, Spanish language is slowly eating away at English's market share among the most popular songs.
Yeah, among the top 10,000 tracks measured by Luminate in its recently released 2023 year-end music report, streaming share of English language content went down by 3.8% since 2021. Which begs the question, where did that 3.8% go?
Well, it went fully into the streaming share of Spanish language tracks, which went up by 3.8%. So today, Spanish is the second most consumed language in music, both in the U.S. and globally.
Right. In the United States, the top three languages in music consumption by percentage of the total are, of course, English, which at 88.8%, followed by Spanish, 8.1%, and Korean in a distant third at 0.7%. But it's funny, when I was at NAMM, I went over to the Hohner booth, and I want to get an accordion. And I was I was talking to the Hohner guy about, and he was from South Texas, and he plays the button accordion. And we were talking about how much Spanish language music has really jumped up in the last couple of years. And again, like you and I have mentioned, with streaming, you can now be adventurous. You can, just start listening and really kind of following your muse.
Yeah.
And again, this whole Spanish language thing will continue to rise here in these states.
Yeah, it's here to stay. The other thing that we talked about a little bit before we hit record was that there was a story in TechCrunch written by Ivan Mehta. And the headline was, "Apple will pay artists more to have a spatial audio version on Apple Music." So Apple's going to pay up to 10% of additional royalties if an artist has all of their songs in spatial audio. The extra money doesn't depend on users playing the spatial audio version, though.
So according to Apple, this change is not only meant to reward higher quality content, but also to ensure that artists are being compensated for the time and investment they put into mixing in spatial.
That makes a lot of sense because you have to spend a little bit more money for those spatial audio, whether it's Sony 360 or Dolby Atmos. It takes a little bit more money. And you and I have talked quite a bit about spatial audio. We're big fans. We've been in the studio. I mean, you brought me up to Ojai to listen to some amazing spatial audio mixes. And man, when you hear that in a studio, it's breathtaking, really.
It is breathtaking. It gives you goosebumps. But it does take time and it takes money. And I applaud this from Apple. Good on them.
Yeah. We had 3 conversations, as you alluded to in the intro this week, that we recorded and we're going to drop into this episode because they're so good. Very smart people, as you alluded to. RUSS CRUPNICK from MusicWatch, independent analyst Richard KRAMER, from my favorite podcast, Bubble Trouble, Will Page. And also Beatdap CEO Morgan HAYDUK. The first one, RUSS CRUPNICK, he wrote this article that we talked about last week. It was titled Monetizing Music Fans, $1 Billion Opportunity or Super Fantasy. And we've been talking so much about super fans lately. And he sort of took a slightly contrarian look at super fans.
Indeed. Russ is a managing partner of MusicWatch, a company dedicated to marketing research and industry analysis for the music and entertainment industry. He is also an adjunct professor at NYU Steinhardt Music Business Graduate Program, where he lectures on marketing strategy, pricing practices, and forecasting.
Yeah, he's just a cool dude. So without further ado, let's listen into a quick conversation with RUSS CRUPNICK. In your article, you point out that Lucian Grange from UMG and Robert Kinsel from Warner Music Group, they've both recently suggested that music fandom is under-monetized. Both of them seeing squeezing more dollars from music fans as a path to growth. But you point out that consumer research suggests that most fans really aren't ready to spend to enhance those relationships. So tell us about your research and what you learned.
Right. Well, just by way of background, every year for the last more than 20 years, we do an annual study of Americans to understand their music and entertainment consumption and habits and listening habits and what they're buying, attitudes and motivations. And when I start to see some of these things being spoken of a lot, like super fans, or as we were chatting before, high-res audio or vinyl, we kind of home in on those and say, okay, well, what do consumers really think about that? And in the study this year, I was curious to look at 2 things. I wanted to know, A, what are they doing now that might represent super fan experiences? And B, what is the kind of interest or potential? So if you start out with the first piece, what are they doing now? What we learned is about 3% of Americans over the age of 13 would say that they've engaged in some kind of superfan experience. It's, some kind of a VIP package created by artists, some kind of ticket bundle, a special release vinyl or CD, and so on. All of the products that could be developed for superfans. So that's 3%. And just, to make it easier for the audience, that translates to about 7.5 million superfans, which is not at all trivial. I mean, just by way of contrast, I think last year we had about 18 million vinyl buyers. So it's not the numbers who are streaming or paying for streaming, but it's not a trivial number. So the next thing was to say, well, what is the potential for this? So we asked people to describe themselves. And we want to know, are you really a super fan for your favorite artist? Do you go to their shows and follow them on social and buy their merch? And most importantly, would you be willing to spend more on VIP experiences for that artist? On the other hand, hey, I'm just interested in listening to them. And about 20% fell into the first bucket, and about 40% fell into the latter bucket. So if you're a glass half empty kind of person, you could say, well, 20% yes, 40% no, that's not so great. The way I would also look at it is, hey, if you think about it, today it's 3%. It's potentially 20%. That's a factor of 7 to 1 versus where we are now. So there are millions and millions of people out there who could potentially be monetized as superfans in some way or another. So again, I'll take the glass half full look and say, hey, there's very few right now, but there could be, I would agree, many more. Just think about if we could get another because I was talking about the opportunity. If we could get another 10 million of those folks to be super fans, and I'm just speaking about in the United States alone, 10 million, we get them to spend another $100, which frankly isn't a whole lot of money in my view, for premium experiences, whether it's a physical product or whether it's merch or something. Another $100. That's $1 billion just in the U.S. alone. So I think when Robert Kinsel says yes, it's untapped and undermonetized, yeah, I would agree, and the data supports his point of view.
Yeah, it's like the old joke, a million here, a million there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. Right?
Exactly.
All right. Russ, thanks again for joining us. We'll talk again soon.
Looking forward to it.
Great.
Thank you.
It's so, and I think I mentioned this last week even, it's so wonderful that we have an opportunity to not only report on a lot of stuff that we find interesting and fascinating, but then also at times we get to have some of the folks come on and chat with us.
Oh my gosh. It is
priceless.
It is so much fun. And I think Russ and I met up, I think it was Music Biz Association conference last time, and just hit it off over a cup of coffee. And he has these great reports that MusicWatch puts out. In fact, there's a new one coming pretty soon, and I'd love to have him come in and help us break it down. The other conversation, 2 of 3, which was incredible. This week, I got to speak with analyst Richard KRAMER, and it was so much fun. He talks really candidly, about how the market has viewed Spotify and music streaming. He's a co-host of Bubble Trouble with Will Page, and I've often talked about that podcast because I don't miss an episode, and it's really great. And the way they describe it's conversations between economist and author Will Page and independent analyst Richard KRAMER, and they lay out inconvenient truths about how financial markets really work. And I know that sounds really technical and over your head, and they make it fun, they're sassy, and they really sort of explain how these things work, and I really love it.
And Richard founded the research firm Arete. They are the leading independent global technology research firm. They recently pioneered the model Honest Financial Markets Research, free from conflicts of interest. And that's always appreciated in that world.
Yeah. Anyway, without further ado, again, brace yourself. Here's my conversation with Richard KRAMER. All right, Richard, you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal recently about Spotify. You said Spotify has consistently led people to believe they would have a profitable business that would justify their valuation, and they use capital raised on the back of that valuation to chase rainbows. None of those rainbows were captured. How has the market viewed Spotify since its 2018 IPO?
Hi, Jay. There's a lot to unpack there. And the first thing I'll quickly correct is that Spotify didn't do an IPO. They did a direct listing. And that meant they avoided some of the scrutiny that kind of happens to companies going public when they go public. The uncomfortable questions they need to be answering about a business model, which is fundamentally, as you know, having worked at the big labels, a distribution business for other companies. So there were, at the time, any number of ideas that the company was kicking around. You knew that they did Spotify for artists, and they had this idea that they've been working on for many years now of all these two-sided marketplace services. And more recently, in the pandemic, the stock went absolutely ballistic because of the expectation that we would all be listening to hours and hours of podcasts like my own Bubble Trouble every day. And then since then, now Spotify's doing audiobooks and they want to do video and so forth. But throughout that all, the company has really not generated any material profits or cash flow, certainly when you exclude the working capital benefit of they collect from me and everybody else at the beginning of the month, and they pay their creditors in 90 days. So it's very easy when you have a big business like that, which could go in any number of directions, to think, why not try them all? Especially when you've been through a direct listing, been given a lot of money, and you go through a period where the cost of capital is near zero to borrow.
According to Luminate's recent year-end report, Of the 184 million tracks that they measured, 152 million, or around 86%, had 1,000 or fewer plays on music services last year. So that's over 45 million that had no plays at all. Spotify is positioning themselves as an audio company instead of a music company, investing in, like you just mentioned, podcasts, audiobooks. How can Spotify and other DSPs create more value and confidence, from this market?
Well, I think you just went through about 3 separate questions we should answer there. Maybe we should break them down one by one.
All right.
So the first one is about just how many tracks there are on Spotify and how difficult it is for even middling artists that do get listened to get any sort of revenue out of it. Now, of course, as you mentioned, Spotify has about a third of the market, so those artists have to get paid from any number of sources. But as you also know, if you think of Spotify's business as a distribution business and think of that product they're distributing being beer as opposed to music. Now, that's a consumable, and music you can listen to again and again. But imagine you open the warehouse and said any brand that wants to store their beer there can just stick it in there. Well, very soon you'd be building tons and tons of warehouses and filling them up, and finding your favorite beer would be darn difficult, right? So Spotify, by opening itself up as a platform which includes professional and what used to be called, before we talked about the creator economy, user-generated content. Remember that with the early days of YouTube?
Yeah.
User-generated content. The crazy
UGC.
idea that we'd all be taking videos and uploading them somewhere. Who'd have thought it? And so Spotify became that platform for all music. And in a much more open way than its peers did. But of course, that means it's polluted with all sorts of nonsense. And, I could be meeting some folks from Beatdap, for example, in London here this week, who believe there's extensive stream fraud on platforms like Spotify. And the combination of all these tracks which are never listened to and all these infinite number of white noise tracks or happy birthday in Hungarian or what have you, they're all there to grab a piece of the pie that gets divvied up. And just back to our core issue of chasing rainbows and running a company like Spotify, there's got to be a huge amount of work required and cost required just dealing with that avalanche, that torrent of new content that never generates any revenue.
A friend of mine coined this phrase, Spotify drunk, and he did that to describe how myopic music business reporting is today. Why do you think there's so much attention placed on Spotify and really so much less on DSPs like, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and the others?
Well, a couple of reasons. The first one, obviously, is that music distribution is Spotify's core business. Whereas for Amazon, Apple, and YouTube Music, they are literally a drop in the ocean of companies with vast revenue bases and cash flows. So where Spotify stands and falls over time as to whether it can cobble together a profitable business distributing music via streaming and all these other ancillary services or content or what have you, and selling ads. These other businesses, it frankly doesn't matter. It doesn't even make it really to the earnings calls. It's barely mentioned. Maybe they'll have a little bit of a press release once a year and throw a few stats around. I mean, I don't know. It's probably been over a year since we heard officially how many Apple Music subscribers there are. But let's take one other issue for Spotify, which is it's a classic founder-led company. And several things I've observed in 30 years of watching tech founders is they tend to be insecure and like a lot of publicity. I think you can think of one particular electric vehicle and social media platform guy who seems to want a lot of attention on themselves. And they think it's in a way part of the content marketing or important for the business development of their services to draw attention to themselves as the plucky upstarts against the big tech giants. And because of that, you have in a company like Spotify, probably an inordinate number of PR and comms people whose job it is to ensure that the business gets talked about all the time. And you also have it as a confluence of all these music industry celebrities, the 1 out of 78 songs in the US this last year streamed was Taylor Swift, right?
Right.
The interest in the NFL has doubled since Taylor Swift shows up at Kansas City Chiefs games, right? And all that silliness, right? But clearly Spotify feeds off that and is part and parcel of that. Please include us in the global conversation, much more so. And I wouldn't be surprised to say that think that you have the same with Netflix versus all the other streaming services combined. And the ones that have the lowest profile or don't get talked about in the same degree, it's not. Spotify is spoken about as that standalone service that either proves or disproves the case that you can exist outside these big tech companies.
All right, Richard, thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
All right.
See you, man.
Take care, Jay.
Great, thank you.
Nice to see you.
Well, he is nothing if not entertaining, isn't he? He's well, and I've talked about this so much. It's just I don't know that world, and I so appreciate having not only folks that can explain that world, but also explain it with a sense of humor and kind of put it in perspective.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful.
Yeah, he makes it so even knuckleheads like us can actually understand, what he's talking about. And again, if you haven't listened to the Bubble Trouble podcast, it is enlightening and it is just so enjoyable to listen to. And one last thing before we get into our stories. If you've been reading anything about streaming fraud protection, that's been such a hot topic lately, and people will pontificate about what percentage of streams are actually fraudulent. Well, in order to find out, the guy that they go to is typically Morgan HAYDUK, and he's the founder and CEO of a company called Beatdap, Beatdap, Beatdap. And they're really the market leader in audit and fraud detection software for music labels, streaming services, all of that stuff. And it's been such a hot topic that I wanted to ask Morgan to pop on and to break it down for us a little bit. So here is the conversation with Morgan HAYDUK from Beatdap. Morgan, thanks for joining me. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
So a couple of things before we jump into, the user-centric versus pro rata thing. Talk a little bit about what you've built over at Beatdap.
Thanks for the question. And we've built, I think, the most sophisticated and effective fraud detection technology purpose-built for the music industry. And it comes at a point where I think we need it more than ever. The revenue in streaming in particular is exploding, and it's showing signs of continued growth in markets all over the world. And ensuring that artists and rights holders are paid correctly, fairly, and appropriately is critical to the sustained success of the industry. And so our view is, like many other online industries that have come before music, once the revenue pot gets to be sufficiently large enough and the channels are there to exploit it, fraudsters step in. And so we've decided that we're going to put them on notice and really make it our mission to make music a much harder target for people who wish to commit fraud in our space.
That's amazing. Talk a little bit about something you and I were sort of bouncing back and forth. And that is, we talk a lot about the user-centric versus pro rata model today. Talk a little bit about what that is, and is either better for fraud detection?
Good question. Let me step back even outside of music for a second. My view on this is that if there was an economic model in online industries of any shape and size, advertising, e-commerce, you name it, if there was an economic model that solved the problem of fraud, someone would have implemented it already, and we would have a bit of a roadmap at least to follow. The truth is, fraudsters are adaptive, and as long as the path into the platform, the path into the industry is there, almost irrespective of the economics, they'll work to try to exploit it. So for lots of reasons, people are positive about pro rata, positive about user-centric, positive about other economic models that have been considered. And I try not to stray into the sort of broader debate about which one is best. But from the perspective of fraud, the way I think about it is this. In the user-centric model, the most valuable type of account is the dormant premium subscriber. And platforms don't share the dormant account figures for obvious reasons, but we know it's, multiple percentage points, sometimes double-digit percentage points or more of accounts that in a given month don't stream at all. the ability to co-opt one of those accounts in a model where each stream is worth, if it's one stream in 1 month, that's a $10 stream or a $7 stream. That's the most effective way to generate revenue in that model. And so what I expect will happen is if everyone tomorrow turned over to user-centric, for a month or two, we would find a lot of anomalies that were evidence of bots running in the pro rata system that are now obvious in a new user-centric model. And we actually do this. We model both types of economic models in our detection to try to find the obvious fraud that would show up in user-centric and doesn't show up in pro rata. But for a month or two, I think we'd catch a bunch of stuff. And then the fraudsters would adapt. And what they would do is they would start trying to steal more legitimate accounts and use those, particularly the dormant ones, as their means to extract revenue. Rather than trying to run up the score with a bot and stream 5,000 times in a month and not get caught, they would find dormant accounts and they would stream 11 times. And so that presents just a new vector of attack and an adaptation to an economic model that I don't think fundamentally eliminates fraud. The last point on this that I'll make, which I think is one of the most interesting, and people are usually kind of aware of how many passwords and usernames are out there available on the internet, but something like 90% of login attempts on consumer-facing websites are what's called credential stuffing. And that is just bad actors testing to see if an illegally obtained set of username and password works on a different website. And once those accounts are confirmed as effective, they're packaged up and sold. So you want to buy Experian has a data breach and you want to go buy those and test to see if they work on American Airlines and Kruger and Spotify. Cool. There's someone in the sort of underbelly of the internet packaging those accounts up and selling them to you, or not to you, but to someone to do this stuff. So it's way easier to obtain account credentials than I think people appreciate.
Wow, Morgan, thanks for clearing that up for us. Super fascinating. We'd love to have you back on to cover some of these things. Congratulations on the growth and the success so far. Where can people learn more about Beatdap?
Beatdap.com. Come to our website. Our emails are for Andrew and I, Morgan@beatdap.com and Andrew@beatdap.com. We're always happy to hear from people, and we're on social as well, so feel free to drop us a line there.
All right. Thank you, Morgan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay.
That's great. Boy, really interesting.
So we don't typically do 3 audio drops in one show, but to talk to these smart people, it was just such an honor, and it's always best when you get it straight from the horse's mouth.
Yes, and we got to get him when we can, and so it just worked out that way.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. Thanks for putting that all together.
Yeah.
Jay. So let's jump into some of the stories. Our story, the first one that we're going to talk about right now, is from Billboard. If the music business keeps growing, why the layoffs? And this is from our friend Glenn Peoples.
Yeah.
And as he starts to say, media business layoffs are hitting the music industry, with more to come from Universal Music and perhaps other labels. And
yeah,
we've both been through it. It totally sucks if you're the one getting laid off.
Oh, it sure does. And we've talked about layoffs. I mean, that's people's lives, and it matters. And there's been so many of them. Like if you listen to the episode last week, we sort of break down a lot of these layoffs. This piece is so timely because we were sort of asking that same question. Like, the music business is growing. We saw the Luminate report. Mm-hmm. Everything looks so positive. And so why the layoffs? And I love how he sort of breaks it down.
Indeed. It says, during an October earnings call, Universal Music Group's CFO Boyd Muir told investors the company was conducting a careful review, that's in quotes, of its costs. In the world of public company statements, that was a hint that UMG expected to make cuts to its workforce of roughly 10,000, specifically hundreds of jobs in the first quarter of the year, as Bloomberg later revealed.
Yeah, they say hundreds of jobs, and they haven't given a specific number or where those are coming from. But, it's horrifying. UMG, they had plenty of company until last year. The music business had, mostly escaped the job cutting that ravaged industries that depend on advertising in 2022 and 2023. That was still best of times for the industry, which had found double-digit growth in streaming. Since 2020, 10 music companies have gone public to take advantage of investors' enthusiasm for music, including labels and publishers, like UMG, Warner Music Group, Hybe, Reservoir, Believe, Roundhill, streaming services Deezer, Angami, Cloud Music, and live entertainment firms, like a spinoff of MSG Entertainment.
Right. So that changed during 2023. In March, WMG's new CEO, Robert Kyncl, a former YouTube executive, laid off around 270 people. That was 4% of the company's workforce, to focus more on technology initiatives and, in quotation marks, new skills for artist and songwriter development, as he wrote in a memo to staff at the time. Downtown Music Holdings, owners of CD Baby, Fuga, Songtrust, and more, also thinned its payroll in May. BMG laid off about 30 people in October. Digital music companies fared even worse in 2023. Spotify cut about 23% of its workforce in 2 rounds of layoffs. Tidal cut 10%. SoundCloud cut 8%. And Bandcamp chopped half its headcount after being acquired by SongTrader.
Oh my gosh. But Universal Music Group, the company's revenue in the first 9 months of 2023 was up 9.4%. We talked about this, on a constant currency basis. 6.8% as reported due to foreign currency fluctuations. So if you want to know the details. More than 2 years after spinning off the former corporate parent Vivendi, UMG is a profitable hit-making machine that owned 29.4% of the U.S. recorded music market last year, easily besting Sony Music's 18.9% and Warner Music Group's 16%. Well, it has Taylor Swift, Morgan Wallen, Drake, and many other big stars. So perhaps understandably, there's been talk that other labels could follow with cuts of, one size or another.
So UMG's decision may be the most dramatic example of just how profoundly the music business is changing and how quickly. Lean is the new black. Bloat, or anything that evokes it, is out. Wow. The old ways of finding, developing, and marketing artists no longer work the way they used to. How big a radio promotion department does a label really need? How many radio promotion departments does its parent company need? At a time when radio no longer plays as important a part in breaking hits. Social media and data analysis matter just as much. So could developing markets that once didn't account for much revenue.
Wow. These are the things that we hear at meetings sort of spoken about.
All the time.
Of course, Glenn finds it and, shines a light on it. UMG's next focus, Chairman CEO Lucian Grange wrote in a memo to staff in early January, will be creating the blueprint for the labels of the future. And to do that by building the technology to do more work in-house, expanding and developing markets, and finding ways to better monetize superfans. Well, we just talked about that. That requires moving resources away from the legacy business, Muir said in an October earnings call, to, quote, benefit from all of the opportunities that we see ahead, end quote. What that will mean for how UMG reshuffles its organizational chart remains to be seen, but it's already building an artist services business with Virgin Music Group and making aggressive moves in developing markets and investments in TM Ventures in India, Chabaka in the United Arab Emirates. And for those that haven't even keeping up on the news, Virgin Music Group, that's sort of this new group combination of in grooves with what used to be known as Caroline, which became Virgin Label and Artist Services, and part of what was M Theory. So put all those powerful teams together, and that's the Virgin Music Group that he's referring to.
So other music companies are also reassessing their priorities. BMG were spurned by new CEO Thomas Coesfield as a response to an international marketing structure that didn't meet expectations and duplicated the efforts of local teams. He wrote in a memo to a staff,
Businesses are repositioning themselves slightly to become more competitive. Downtown Music President Peter Van Ryn says, "One must always be mindful and not get complacent," he added, noting that the company needed to stay nimble enough to respond to the marketplace. Quote, "What you do see in general is the music industry is maturing. The digital growth is still there, but it's slowing down."
Well, as the article goes on to say, the world is changing too. Along with the major labels, companies like Believe and Reservoir Media are investing in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and other regions where music revenue is growing. And both new companies and the established majors are expanding their artist services business to court creators who can now choose from among an increasing number of alternatives to a traditional major label deal. Sony acquired the artist service company AWAL in 2022. UMG is building up Virgin, and WMG's Kinsel wrote in an early January memo that he wants to augment services to the, in quotation marks, middle class of artists and scale up the company's publishing administration business.
Yeah. Public companies in the music industry face pressure from investors to constantly improve their bottom lines, especially as streaming growth sort of levels off. 2.5 years ago, we started making cuts because we knew the market was no longer just about growth, said Rob Ellen. He's the CEO of the streaming company Live One, which is cutting up to 100 staffers in a restructuring. You had to be profitable.
Right. The growth over profits era finally ended at Spotify, too, when the streaming giant announced it would cut 17% of its global workforce in December. CEO Daniel Ek explained that costs were too high, efficiency was too low, and too few people contributed to opportunities with real impact. Cutting roughly 1,500 jobs and seeking a replacement for CFO Paul Vogel, Ek wrote in an open letter, were necessary to become relentlessly resourceful.
Wow, 1,500 jobs. Record labels and music publishers have better margins than Spotify, right? Which will rarely turn a profit, but investors also expect more of them. In the first half of 2021, UMG, then a subsidiary of Vivendi, had a margin of about 21.5% in earnings, EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, and told investors in August it expected to reach the quote-unquote mid-20s soon. 2 years later, revenue had increased 34%, but its EBITDA margin, which we just described, was almost unchanged at 21.5%, right? With layoffs can come better margins. Restructuring saved Warner Music Group $19 million in fiscal year that ended September 30th, and Barclays analysts estimated that UMG's layoffs could save the company $70 million annually.
Wow. But to those who remember the crisis caused by the death of the CD, this talk of restructuring might have a familiar ring, and that would be me. Yes, it does. As piracy ravaged the music business, the majors scaled back their physical distribution businesses, sold their CD pressing plants, and retooled for a digital world. That's why Grange reminded investors that UMG is no stranger to managing disruption. He said, "We've got decades of experience in executing cost-cutting programs in the various cycles of the industry, right back to the piracy days," he said during the October earnings call. And currently, he said, we're seeing a change in the business. Well, that is just, your heart breaks for the people that are on the chopping block. Yeah. And we've both been there. And
it doesn't feel good.
What you don't see, it doesn't feel good, but what you don't see is that Lucien is willing to cut his own salary to make that business more profitable. And so you see a lot of these folks making these statements that are making an awful lot of money.
Well, my hat's off to Glenn Peoples, our friend over at Billboard, for this piece, because it's something very concise and succinct that we needed, and again, that headline, "If the music business keeps growing, why the layoffs?" And I think he sort of digs in and answers that question for us.
Well, Jay, as we get near the end of the program, we do want to make sure we thank our sponsors. The Your Morning Coffee podcast is brought to you by our friends at Bandzoogle. For over 20 years, Bandzoogle has made it easy to build a stunning website and online store for your music. Now they've added a brand new EPK plan so that musicians can create a professional single-page electronic press kit in minutes. All the features you need to design an EPK are already built in, including fully customizable templates, preset EPK page layouts, music players, images, text bio, and video embeds, a gig calendar and press quotes, and access to Bandzoogel's award-winning support team 7 days a week. The new EPK plan starts at just $6.95 per month, and Your Morning Coffee podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it free for 30 days. Then use the promo code MorningCoffeeEPK, all one word, to get 10% off the first year of the new EPK plan subscription. That's bandzoogle.com/promo code MorningCoffeeEPK when you sign up to the EPK plan.
Yeah, and we're also brought to you by Hypebot. Since 2004, Hypebot has chronicled the new music industry and the trends and technologies that are changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. It's edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton with help from Alana Bonilla. Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music discovery and marketing platform Bandsintown.
You betcha. Bandsintown. Over 80 million live music fans trust Bandsintown to get personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It's the #1 artist service platform connecting over 590,000 artists with their superfans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms.
Yeah, and we also want to thank the Music Business Association. We've got the Music Biz Conference coming up soon. It creates the rooms in which important conversations that shape the future of our industry, that's where they take place. It represents more than 90% of the music industry at large. The association serves as the connective tissue for the global music business and provides a trusted forum where ideas and collaborations can flourish. So join us for the Music Biz 2024 conference in Nashville, Tennessee, May 13th. Through the 16th.
And let me tell you, every week I get to hang out with my good friend Jay Gilbert. He's a music industry consultant. He's the curator of the weekly Your Morning Coffee newsletter and a former executive with Universal Music, Sony Music, and the Warner Music Groups, and an all-around groovy guy.
It's a highlight of my week is chatting with Mike Etchart, longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music Group, Capital EMI, and Universal Music Group.
Big thanks to Bandzoogle, Hypebot, Bandsintown, and the Music Business Association. We certainly appreciate all that support.
And our third and final story today was from MusicWeek, and the headline was Industry Leaders on Key Issues, including Artist Development, Exports, and AI. And if you don't know about MusicWeek, we check in on them quite often. They've been sort of the leading trade brand for UK music industry for over 50 years, and really essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the music business from vinyl to streaming from that UK perspective. And as well as covering industry news, their editorial team creates exclusive content that dives into, key industry issues. Check out their website. They do, it is UK centric, but I pull some really great articles from there each week.
A new year brings new purpose, and with it, MusicWeek's roundup of what some of the leading lights in the music industry are wishing for over the next 12 months. So here they delve into hopes and dreams of a range of leading names from across the business. Our friend Merck Mercuriadis over at Hypnosis Song says, "My hope every year is that the recorded music industry will recognize the work of songwriters and reward them properly.
Amen.
No one in our industry should get paid more than songwriters, without whom there would be nothing. I'm delighted that every year we are making progress and the narrative is changing due to our efforts and the efforts of a few others."
Yeah, I thought that was the most important one of the list, but there's some really smart people, in this piece that they asked, sort of for their wish list. And one was Suzanne Bull from Attitude is Everything. And she said, "My hope is that the industry starts to regard access and environmental sustainability as part of the same conversation. We've all heard the phrase that there is no music on a dead planet. Well, there's no access on a dead planet either."
Right. Janella Powell over at Apple Music in the UK says, I'm excited to see women championing women and more industry programs around championing women. Our platoon team ran an event in 2023 called She Runs the Boards, which was focused on celebrating engineers, producers, and songwriters. I just hope there's more that the business can do to celebrate women and make it feel like a safe space and industry for women.
Yeah, and continuing on this wish list for the year, Emma Banks from CAA said, "We are coming off an incredibly strong year of live touring in 2023. I hope that 2024 can be just as good. Stronger still would be even better. Also, that we work out ways to reinvest in live music and performance across venues of all sizes, from the smallest club to the biggest stadium."
Yes, and Kenya King over at Mobo said, "I'm trying not to sound like a broken record, but I hope that the industry will continue to push forward to increase diversity and inclusion both on stage and behind the scenes." Absolutely. So good hopes for this year. And on that note, we're going to wrap up episode 181. We want to thank everyone for listening in. Jay and I certainly appreciate it. And we'll be back next week again with the Your Morning Coffee podcast.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.